Right, so in the second part of proteins, we're going to look at how protein can be denatured and how it's going to affect the functionality of protein in food system. Hopefully by the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the denaturation process of protein and its effect on food, and for you to relate the physiochemical and functionality of proteins in food. So the native structure of proteins, as we covered in the first part of protein, is a net result of various attractive and repulsive interaction that emanates from different intermolecular forces, as well as interaction of various protein group with the surrounding solvent water. But we know that proteins are not static, they're not rigid, they can be easily, at the same time, how they can be folded, they can also be unfolded. So the unfolding of the protein, we call this as protein denaturation, or in a more exact definition is that it's a phenomenon that involves transformation of a well-defined folded structure of a protein. We call this as protein in its native state. Okay, that is formed under a physiological condition to an unfolded state, or the denatured state under non-physiological condition. There are several denaturing agents. Okay, so what happens during this denaturation is that protein is going to lose its biological activity, and this process only affects the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure of the protein without having any effect on the primary structure. Just summary between the two states of proteins, whether they're in denatured state and native state. Okay, normally proteins in native state, they are more stable and more soluble, where the polar group tend to be on the outer layer and the non-polar is in the interior of the protein. Whereas in the denatured state, what happens is that the protein is going to lose its native conformation and affect the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure. This one doesn't, as I mentioned before, doesn't affect the primary structure. This process can be reversible or it can be irreversible. It can be either partial denaturation or complete denaturation. So what happened to proteins once it becomes denatured is that it will decrease its solubility, at the same time it's increased viscosity and alter the functional properties. Later we're going to look into how the denaturation will affect the functional property of proteins in food system. Okay, if for enzymes, upon denaturation is going to lose its activity. In some cases, denaturation can also increase digestibility of the protein. So there are many factors that affect the denaturation of proteins, such as heat, pH, pressure, oxidation, salt, and chemotropic agents. Here we can see that the native structure of a protein is the energetic minimum under physiological protein. So any change in conformation away from this shape will represent an energy cost. Because protein is not completely static, it will flex and bend in response to the thermal energy of binding ligands. However, naturally they will tend to return to the same shape. But if you move this protein out of its physiological state, the balance of forces acting will be changed, and now the protein may respond to change shape to minimize its energy under the new condition. Okay, for them to find the proper folding with the lowest energy state back into native state can be an issue. If it doesn't find, then this protein will remain in this denatured state, but with higher energy state. Okay, example, globular protein, they fold up tightly in water to hide these hydrophobic residues, but if you move this globular protein into an organic solvent, it will want to unfold now, because then it want to hide its hydrophobic group. It want to hide this hydrophilic group away from the non-polar solvent. Okay, so now protein will unravel and they will become denatured. Just to show you the behavior of denatured protein, so for native protein, you can see that it has this hydrophobic core and hydrophilic surface. So the hydrophilic will maintain this solvation layers with bound water. So this will maintain the solubility of the protein because of the attractive force between the proteins remain dampened. But if you put this native protein under non-physiological conditions such as heating or due to this in the non-polar solvent, what's going to happen, the protein will start to unravel and denature, and this will somehow force some of the hydrophobic amino acids to the surface. if they aren't able to refold back into its native state, okay, they will tend to aggregate as they form this hydrophobic interaction with another denatured protein with exposed hydrophobic region. Okay, so aggregated protein tend to be less soluble, and normally with aggregated protein, this protein cannot be refolded back into its native state. So the functional properties of the protein now has been lost. Factors that can cause denaturation, one example would be temperature. Okay, so high temperature can destabilize the non-covalent interaction that hold the protein together, causing it to eventually unfold. Not really high temperature, low temperature at freezing condition can also denature protein by weakening the hydrophobic interaction within the protein at the same time due to the formation of ice crystal. This can also cause protein denaturation. Protein stability of thermal denaturation can also be influenced by the amino acid composition. Okay, if it contains more of this disulfide bond, it's going to be more stable. Okay, if the protein concentration can also affect the denaturation level, less concentrated protein is allow the protein to denaturation to be reversible more than high concentration. Water content also can influence the denaturation rate. Dry protein technically is more stable compared to hydrated protein, and the presence of salt and sugar can also help increasing the stability of protein. It can also cause denaturation because too much charge can cause high electrostatic repulsion between charged amino acids, and the protein structure will start to unfold. So when the protein unfolds, it will expose the hydrophobic into the outer layer. So the degree of unfolding is higher in extreme alkaline pH compared to acidic pH. This is due to the ionization of partially buried carboxyl, phenolic, and sulfur group, which then unravel the polypeptide chain. Okay, so pH-induced denaturation is mostly reversible unless there's a deamidation of asparagine and glycine or destruction of sulfur group at alkaline pH. Okay, detergent can also cause protein denaturation because detergent prefer to interact with the hydrophobic part of the protein due to this hydrophobic tail here. So detergent-induced denaturation is normally irreversible because of the strong binding of detergent to protein. Okay, in protein extraction, sometimes this addition of detergent is favorable because it increases the solubility of the protein, but the side effect is that now the protein become denatured. It can also be denatured due to surface denaturation by the presence of lipid or air. So lipid and air here act as the hydrophobic phase. Okay, so what happens when in contact with protein, the hydrophobic interior of protein will then unravel and interact with this hydrophobic air or lipid phase. Okay, this good example will be foam and emulsion. I'll talk about it later in detail. So when there's this hydrophobic surface presence, what's going to happen is that this the aqueous protein will then absorb at the interface that allow any hydrophobic surface patch to move out of the aqueous environment. So now the surface protein may then be unfolded at the surface to allow more of the hydrophobic amino acid to move into the non-polar environment. So this will cause the protein to unravel, and mechanical energy such as whipping can also physically rip the protein apart, and this will then introduce protein to hydrophobic phase such as air or lipid. Highly flexible protein denature more readily at an air-liquid interface compared to rigid protein. So now we're going to look how the functional properties of proteins and what are factors that affect their function. Protein denaturation, we know that protein denaturation can cause protein to lose its biological activity. For food protein, denaturation may cause loss of solubility, but when it comes to food application, protein denaturation may be highly desirable. Okay, for example, partially denatured of protein at air, water, and oil-water interface can help improve their forming and emulsifying properties, but in excess, it may diminish. In excess of heat can diminish their forming and emulsifying properties. Okay, Generally, partially denatured proteins are more digestible than native proteins. Okay. And then heating is also prerequisite for heat-induced gelation of protein that we can observe in meat and egg. Therefore, in order to develop appropriate processing strategies, it's important to have a basic understanding of the environment and other factors that can affect the structural stability of protein in food system. So here, the protein functionality is referring to the physical and chemical properties of protein molecules that affect their behavior in food product during processing, storage, and consumption. The functional properties of protein can contribute to the quality, organoleptic properties, and processing yield of protein. And the functional properties of food proteins are good to be characterized in order to optimize their use in food product. Okay, you can see the interaction of how the intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors of the protein structure can affect its functionality. The various functional properties of protein can be viewed as manifestation of these three molecular aspects of proteins, which is the hydration properties, protein surface related properties, and as well as hydrodynamic rheological properties. Okay, so for hydration, the function of proteins can affect the solubility, dispersibility, wettability, swelling, thickening, water binding capacity, and water holding capacity. Whereas for the surface activity protein can affect its emulsification, forming, flavor binding, and pigment binding function, whereas for the hydrodynamic rheology, this will affect the elasticity, viscosity, chewiness addition, gelation, as well as dough formation. So functional properties are performed by proteins in food systems such as hydration. I just have here two examples. Okay, for example, the solubility functional properties of proteins. Okay, it involve the protein solvation, but then solubility of proteins is highly dependent on pH. Okay, this one of the important food system that involve protein solubility will be beverages. Example would be whey protein. You also have water absorption and binding, where the hydrogen bond of the water and entrapment of water. Okay, this is particularly important in different food systems such as meat, sausages, bread, and cake. Okay, and the type of proteins that are involved is the muscle protein eggs. So the functional properties of proteins are often affected by their solubility, and most of those affected are thickening, foaming, emulsifying, and gelling. We know that insoluble protein have very limited use in food. They can be affected by balance of hydrophobic and hydrophilic amino acid on its surface. So charged amino acids of the protein play the most important role in keeping the protein soluble. So what happens here, if the pH is more or less than the isoelectric point, the protein will tend to repulse and maintain its solubility. But if the pH of the environment is the same as the isoelectric point of the protein now become neutral, the charge will be neutralized, and now they be aggregated, which is not favorable if you want to maintain the solubility of protein. The solubility can be affected by salt concentration, okay, which give ionic strength. At low salt concentration, you can see here protein solubility will tend to increase. We call this process salting in, but as you increase the salt concentration, the protein will now become less soluble. We call this process as salting out. So the maturation of protein can increase or decrease protein solubility, which is very depending on the condition. Okay, pH can affect solubility because at very high and low pH will denature the protein, but the protein will become soluble because there is so much repulsion. Temperature will also affect the solubility of proteins. What happens if the temperature is too low or too high? This will reduce solubility of proteins because the denature of protein will expose to the hydrophobic group, and this will lead to the aggregation of protein. Aggregation can be desirable, for example, for the gelation formation, or it can be undesirable in food product. There are ways of how we can measure solubility, but most of the methods are highly empirical, and the result can vary greatly with different protein concentration, pH, salt, mixing condition, and temperature. Generally, how you analyze protein solubility is by putting protein in the samples at different pH, and then you centrifuge. So the more protein stay in solution, means that they are in supernatant, the more soluble the protein is. So the bigger the palette, okay, means that the protein becomes less soluble. Okay, so you can actually calculate the protein left in the supernatant divided by total protein times by 100 will give you the percentage of solubility. The functional properties performed by protein food system, we talk about the surface activity of protein can affect different functionality, such as emulsification, okay, flavor binding, foaming, and fat absorption. I'm going to cover some of these in this particular lecture. Emulsification, for example, where the protein help in the formation and stabilization of fat emulsion. Okay, or fat absorption is where the protein helps in the binding of free fat. Flavor is where the absorption, entrapment, and release of the volatile compound with the proteins can happen. Protein may need to be denatured a bit for this absorption to happen. And lastly, on foaming, where the protein help in stabilizing the film, okay, of the foam to help entrap this gas. It does further stabilize the foam. Protein can be excellent emulsifiers because they contain both the hydrophobic and hydrophilic group. Okay, so that can help decrease the interfacial tension, thus allow stability. So let's say, for example, here you have water and oil, they cannot mix together, but if you mix these two by shaking, it will give you a temporary emulsion. But if you leave it over time, the water and oil phase will be separated again. But if you add protein, okay, as emulsifier into the water and oil, when you shake them, this will give you a stable emulsion, because what happens is the protein denature and the polar region of the protein will be oriented towards the aqueous solution, the water, whereas the non-polar protein will oriented towards the oil phase. Okay? There are many factors that affect the protein-based emulsion. One is the type of protein. So for protein to be a good emulsion, it has to be able to rapidly migrate to the oil-water interface and then readily open up and orient its polar and non-polar side chain to the proper phase, and lastly form a stable film around the oil drop. So there are few factors that can affect the protein emulsifier properties. One is the solubility of the protein. Insoluble proteins are not a good emulsion. If you can increase the solubility of protein, this will also increase the emulsification ability to a certain point. It's also important to look into the distribution of hydrophobic and hydrophilic amino acids. It has to be in a proper balance. Generally, if you increase surface hydrophobicity, this will also increase its emulsifying properties. In terms of the shape of the protein, globular is better than fibrous, and the more flexible the protein is, the easier for the protein to open up. Therefore, it's a better emulsifier. So how you can measure emulsifying properties? There are two common methods, either by looking at the emulsification capacity. This is by titrating oil into emulsion that use protein as emulsifier while mixing, and the max amount of oil that can be added to the protein is known as the emulsification capacity. We can also look at emulsification stability, where we when the emulsion is formed, then we monitor the breakdown of the separation of water and oil phase with time. So observe this stability over time. So just to show you here an example of two proteins, one is casein from milk and another one is soy from the globular plant protein. Okay, so if you look here, casein, which is a casein, it tells here that 0.5% of protein has emulsifying capacity of 1800 gram of oil per gram of proteins, whereas for soy proteins at 1% protein has EC of 1500 gram of oil per gram of proteins. So in this case, although both of them can be good emulsifier, but casein seems to be a better emulsifier. Why so? Because if you look at casein, these are the structure. Casein doesn't have a very definitive three-dimensional structure. The reason why is because it has high number of proline residues in its amino acid sequence. Okay, 70% of casein is proline, so they exist as a random structure. So what it means here is that casein is more open and flexible with exposed hydrophobic residues. This also means that it has higher surface absorption. And casein is also highly amphiphilic or amphipathic, make them a natural emulsifier. For soy globulin protein, or this 11S globulin protein, if you look at the structure here, it's made up of 3 subunits of proteins. Okay, structurally, it is more stable and complex. It has secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure, and it's also held together strongly by disulfide bridges that stabilizes the protein. So compared to casein, this soy globulin protein is less open and less flexible. So you need to denature the protein in order for it to be unraveled. Despite that, it's still considered a good emulsifier, but it just have lower emulsifying capacity compared to casein. Foaming. Okay, so foams are very similar to emulsion, where air is the hydrophobic phase instead of oil. So the principle of foam formation is similar to the emulsion formation, where the protein needs to unravel and orientate the non-polar region of the protein towards the hydrophobic phase, which is the air, and then the polar region of the proteins towards the water or the aqueous solution, which is the polar phase. Okay, so foam can be formed by injecting gas or air into solution through small orifice disparging, or through mechanical whipping, or even through gas release in food, such as yeast fermentation. This is common for the leavening of bread. Here, just to show you that different protein have different forming capacity. So here we have a whip protein solution. Okay, what we can conclude from this result is that albumin has better forming capacity compared to whey protein and bovine serum albumin. So in forming, okay, how protein involved in the foam formation. So protein first, upon mechanical shearing, okay, they will start to denature, and then the protein will then be absorbed, okay, where the non-polar region of the protein will oriented towards the to the air, and then the polar region will oriented towards the polar, which is the water phase. Okay, so this adsorption allow the film formation, where now the air is trapped in between the film, and upon contact, this will lead to the foam formation. But this structure is not stable, where protein will tend to undergo this repair condition, and they tend to coagulate and disrupt. This will cause the foam to collapse. There are a few factors that can affect foam formation and stability. One is, the most important part is the type of protein. So good foaming protein is able to exhibit high rate of diffusion absorption in the interface, and able to form intermolecular association with other molecules. This will help in the formation of film. Okay, the increase in surface hydrophobicity is good, partially denaturing the protein, often produce better foam, and globular proteins are known to be better at foam formation than fibrous proteins. So pH can also affect the foam formation stability. Generally, foam will form better, okay, when they are slightly away from Pi, but when it comes to stability of foam, it's always better to be at isoelectric point, okay, because if the pH is farther than the isoelectric point, there will be more repulsion, and this will cause the foam to break down. Good example will be if you beat white egg to make meringue, it's good to add cream and tartar, because both of them are acidic. This helps in increasing the stability of the foam. Okay, salt can also affect the foam formation and stability. Again, this one depends on the type of protein. Proteins such as egg, albumin, soy protein, and gluten. Normally, if you increase salt, this will improve the foaming stability, because what happens is the net charge is decreased. So protein loss its solubility, this is or salting out. But for whey protein, okay, increasing salt will have this negative effect on the foam, because this will make protein be more soluble, and we call this a salting in. Lipids can also affect the formation of foam and stability, because they usually inhibit foaming by adsorbing to the air-water interface and thinning. So now, because lipid is also hydrophobic, so now the protein, instead of orienting towards the air, it will also orient itself to the lipid. So this will cause the thinning of the film formation and can cause collapse of the foam. So example given here again when we talk about meringue. Okay, so if you beat white egg, okay, it can be foam, right? Turn into this meringue, like a very good foam. But what happens if even a small amount of yolk egg, okay, is present in your white egg? Even if you try to beat it many times, you're not going to be able to make it foamy, because the lipid in the egg yolk will inhibit the formation of foaming of the egg white. Cream, however, is an exception because they have very high level of saturated fat, and this helps in stabilizing foam. Moreover, cold coagulous fat droplet held in surrounding protein thus encapsulated air bubble. You can also add stabilizing ingredient to further stabilize the foam formation. Okay, ingredient that increase viscosity of the liquid phase help in stabilizing foam, such as sugar, okay, sucrose, gum, polyol, etc. That's why when you beat egg, okay, white egg, okay, normally you will add sugar slowly at later stage of foam formation in order to help stabilizing the foam. Addition of flour to form egg white also help in stabilizing the foam. This is common, for example, you talk about angel cake and chiffon cake. Energy input can also affect the foam formation. If the speed of whipping and the time used to foam a protein is very important. If too much energy or too long whipping time, this can produce poor foam because the protein becomes too denatured, and this will cause the foam structure to break down. Right, so there are two ways of how we can measure foam formation stability. One is to measure overrun. Okay, this is to measure foam formation, where you start with the known volume of protein solution. You foam it by whipping, and then you measure the volume of foam versus that of the liquid. So the percentage of overrun is the volume of foam, subtract with the initial liquid volume divided by initial liquid volume times 100. For foam stability, we need to use a special cylinder, and we measure the amount of liquid that drain from the foam on storage to get a mole per minute or mole per hour of drain value. So the smaller the value, the more stable the foam is. Briefly, I'm just going to cover on this protein flavor binding. So some the affinity of flavor to protein is multifactorial because it depends on the protein source, protein conformation, and stoichiometry of the flavor compound. So here, just to give an example, we have flavor P, H, and E. P is bento-1-ol, H is hexanyl, and flavor E is octanyl. You can see that for flavor P to bind to the protein, it will bind through this forming hydrogen bond with the side chain of the amino acid in the proteins. Okay, same goes for flavor H, but for flavor E, okay, which is 2-octaoctanol, it will be bind to the protein through this hydrophobic interaction. So here, just to show you as well the protein hydrophobic interaction of non-polar volatile compounds such as aldehyde and ketone. Okay, so the aldehyde can form this hydrophobic interaction with the hydrophobic side chain of leucine, which is aliphatic side chain here. So, okay, so for hydrodynamic, how protein held in the gelation of protein is through protein matrix formation and thickening. Okay, this is common for meat and curd as well as cheese. I'm not going to cover on the others, focusing more on the jelly. So we talk about gelation. This is a continuous 3D network of protein that entrap water. So here, an intermediate phase between solid and liquid. It works by protein-protein interaction and protein-water interaction. So what happens is protein in solution, once it denatured, okay, So when you remove the temperature, now the protein will want to fold back. So, but instead of folding back, they will form a matrix and then trap water in between. Okay, so this gelation of protein contribute to the texture, quality, and sensory attributes of many food. Common gelation protein can be observed in sausage, cheese, yogurt, and custard. So gel can be formed and protein denatured by either heating, pH, pressure, shearing, and solvent. Of gelation. Normally in food, gelation can be formed through thermal processing. Okay, this is the most common. So what happens is that the protein structure will be unfolded by heating, and this will expose its hydrophobic region, and this will cause the protein to aggregate, because then they form this cross-link network. This aggregation can either be reversible or irreversible. So for example, you have native protein, when you heat, the protein will unfold, and this protein over time will then form interaction. Okay, upon cooling, they will reach this gel point and form this primary matrix, and over time it will start to form this equilibrium stable matrix. There are two different types of gelation. It can either be thermoset, or we call this as thermally irreversible gel. So thermoset gel, good example will be such as eggs. Okay, so raw eggs is very viscous liquid, but upon heating, this protein will be aggregated, forming a gelation, undergo this gelation process, and what you have is this white opaque gel, okay, solid gel. Okay, with thermoset gel, they form chemical bond that will not break during reheating of the gel. So even if you try to reheat this cooked egg, they will still remain as gel. They remain rigid. Okay, so balancing act of force is critical in gel formation. If the attraction force between the protein are too weak, they're not going to form gel. But if it's too strong, what's going to happen is protein will precipitate. So too diluted, if the protein is too diluted in water, they're not going to form good gel. Right? So here, just to show you a graph here, see the level of denaturation, overheating. Okay, when you heat, the protein is going to denature. Okay, and over time, for thermoset, the protein is going to increase in terms of its gel strength and viscosity. Okay, so this top here, I'm just going to show you here. Okay, so now this gel, this thermoset gel, such as cooked egg, upon cooling and upon reheating, you're still going to maintain the gel strength and viscosity. And we also have this thermally reversible gel, or we call this as thermoplastic. Okay, so these are the gel that is formed on cooling after heating, and upon reheating, it's going to revert back to its back into solution. Okay, or we call this as melting. Good example of thermoplastic protein will be collagen. So collagen is native state here. Native collagen is in solid state. So upon heating, okay, this will increase the denaturation of the protein. Okay, the protein now become gelatin with lower gel strength and viscosity, so they pretty much melt. But if you cool it off, gelatin, it will start to refold and become gel-like, okay, solid gel-like. Okay, but if you reheat this refolding gelatin, they will go back to this, it will melt into this gelatin with lower gel strength and viscosity. There are many factors that can affect the gel properties. One is pH. Again, this one depends on the types of protein. Okay, some protein, they form better gels at the isoelectric point, because it means there's no repulsion. The protein tend to get aggregate when it close to Pi. So this will produce soft and opaque types of gel. But some proteins, they give better gel away from the isoelectric point, because this will cause more repulsion and string-like gel. Normally, these types of protein will form stronger, more elastic and transparent types of gel. However, if your Okay, however, if the PI is too far away, if the pH is too far away from the PI, you may not get gel because there's too much repulsion. Now the protein will remain soluble. So if you, by playing with pH, you can play with texture of food gel, producing different texture for different food. Salt concentration can also affect the gel properties. This is ionic strength. Again, this depends on protein. So some protein, they need to be solubilized with salt before they're able to form gel. Example will be muscle protein. But some protein, they don't form good gel in salt because what happens is salt will minimize the necessary electrostatic interaction between protein. Example given here, so this gel formation of protein is held together through the repulsion of the charge. However, when you add salt, the chloride will then neutralize this charge, okay, then causes the structure to collapse. This will cause loss of repulsion, gel strength, and water holding capacity. Many ways of how we can measure gel quality, but gel texture and gel water holding capacity are the most commonly used methods. One of the better texture methods is to twist a gel in modified viscometer and measure its response in terms of stress and strain until it breaks. We call this as torsion test. Right, so that will conclude on the protein denaturation as well as on the functionality of protein.